Hi everyone, my name is Romy Dupal Demers. I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm a dog trainer. I have a company called The Barkside. At The Barkside, we do all kinds of dog training, going from behavior to obedience, freestyle, agility. I compete with my dogs in agility as well, and I do performance shows with them, showing all kinds of different sports that you can do with your dogs. What I do as a full-time job, though, is quite different. I'm a zookeeper at the Calgary Zoo, which means I take care of a really wide variety of exotic species. I've worked with otters, penguins, red pandas, snow leopards, tigers, gorillas, and a really wide variety of primates and small and big cats as well. So what I'd like to tell you a little bit more about today is a little bit about what my job involves, and how what we've learned from working with exotic animals in zoos can actually be applied to pets at home as well. So what we do at the zoo, a really big part of our job is making sure that our animals are healthy, but also that they're mentally kept busy. So a really big word that we always use and comes back all the time in my profession is called husbandry. So the really most basic definition of husbandry is just the science of caring for animals. But with our job, we try to make it a little bit more advanced than just caring for our animals. So the definition that we've been using mostly with zoos is actually maintaining health and the well-being of animals. And when we talk about the well-being, we don't just mean their physical well-being, we also mean their mental well-being. We want to make sure that these animals are just as healthy mentally as they are physically. So for exotic animals, what that means a lot of the times is trying to mimic what they would do in the wild. We would love for these animals to be in the wild. Unfortunately, because of a lot of the times human fault, those species are actually not doing so good in the wild, and we have to try and help them to preserve their species. So what we try to do in zoos is make sure that the animal is as close as possible to what they would be doing in the wild. And we've actually learned a lot from that we can apply to our pets at home. So first off, I'd like to just talk about a really basic concept, which is called the 5 freedoms of animal care. So 5 freedoms, those are really, really important, because if those 5 things are not met for an animal in a zoo, then we cannot expect that animal to show us their natural behaviors, and also breeding and other things that would be really important for that animal to have a healthy and good life at the zoo. So those 5 freedoms, first one, of course, is hunger and thirst. So we don't want to ever have an animal that doesn't have enough food or doesn't have access to water. So that's a really important one, freedom from hunger and thirst. Second one is freedom from discomfort. So these animals in the wild would have a choice of going from an area to another, choosing where they would like to sleep and choosing where they would like to spend their day. At the zoo, they don't have those choices. A lot of the times those enclosures, as big as we would like them to be, they still contain them into an area, which means that the animal, if we don't provide them for shelter and shade, they actually cannot choose to go somewhere else. So we need to make sure that all of those needs are met so that these animals are healthy and keep showing us those natural behaviors that they would do in the wild. So those were the first 2. The third one is a freedom from pain, injury, and disease. That's a really important one, of course. We don't want the animals to be suffering. We don't want them to get injured. So we need to make sure those exhibits and the toys and everything else that we do for them has to be safe for them. And something that's safe for one species might not be safe for another. So that's our responsibility to make sure that we are meeting the needs of that one species that we're working with. Disease, of course, so we owe these animals really good health care. We have veterinarians that work at our zoo and make sure that the animals are as healthy as they could possibly be. Those were the first 3. The fourth one is a freedom to express natural behavior. That's a really important one. An animal in the wild will choose to do any behavior that they want at any time. So they will follow their natural instinct and do all kinds of the behaviors all day long. At the zoo, we need to make sure that even though they might not be able to hunt like they would do in the wild or look for food like they would need to in the wild, we need to make sure that they still have to maybe work for their food or have to fight for their food a little bit. So that means, for example, putting a carcass that's not really easily accessible for a carnivore, and the animal has to really pull on the carcass to try to get it free so that they can eat it. So it might not replicate exactly the whole chase and kill sequence that a wild animal would do, but it still is putting in that effort to try and get the food. So that was just a quick example, but we'll come back and take a look at more of those options that we can do. The last freedom is called the freedom from fear and distress. That's another really big one because an animal that's in captivity doesn't have, again, a choice of leaving if they would like to. So we need to make sure that they are not feeling distressed and that they do not experience a great amount of fear. So some fear is actually okay because in the wild that is also what they would experience. But what we want to make sure is that they have the choice and the ability to get away from some fear and some stress in a really controlled amount. So those were the 5 freedoms that are really important for zookeepers and any person that watch and takes care for animals, really. Our pets have the same sort of freedoms that they should be entitled to. So I've already talked a little bit about enrichment in the first part of the talk, but I would like to go a little bit more in detail on this subject now. Enrichment can be training, but it can also be things like toys and stimulation that the animals will get throughout their day. Basically, it's anything that will make the animal look or spend a little bit more time in the one area that maybe they wouldn't spend time normally. So for zoo animals, what that means is that we try to give them different kinds of enrichment throughout the day. So there's usually 5 enrichment categories that we try to stick to. So the first one is social enrichment. So that means that animals can get stimulation from other animals. So that can be an animal that they already live with, or it can be animals that they can see in a different enclosure. So in an enrichment category, what we try to do with this is we try to give them things that will make their day a little bit easier to interact with either other animals in their own enclosure or from a distance. So what that can be is giving them a toy that can be interacted with different animals. That way they have to work together to work with the toy. Or it can be a smell and a scent. That means that maybe an animal will want to mark on it, and then the second animal will come over and mark on it as well. So it's just giving them things that can make them interact with each other a little bit more. The second type of enrichment is cognitive enrichment. That usually is a little bit of an easier one. Training is a big cognitive enrichment. So it's anything that makes their brain work, basically. So it can be a toy that they have to figure out how to get food out of. It can be puzzle toys just with a different substance in it. So for example, for a cat, we can use, for a tiger, we can put feathers in a ball and then they have to try and roll the ball around to try and get the feathers out. And because cats are just like our domestic cats at home, they love to play with feathers. So that's one thing that we can do so that they are busy for a little longer. And they also have to use their brains to try and figure out how to operate this toy.
Yeah! Yeah, sorry!
Oh, fail. You're going to fail block.
Another type of enrichment is physical habitat. So basically that's the animal's living space. So if that living space always stays the same, sometimes it can get quite boring for an animal. Even just switching some furniture around in the animal's enclosure, that can be enriching on its own, because an animal that would normally go one way through the enclosure now has to go another way and has to go around different objects. So that's one thing that we can do at home with our pets as well, and we'll take a look at how we can apply that one, because that is actually something that we don't often think about doing with our animals at home. Another type of enrichment is sensory enrichment. So that is any kind of enrichment that will use the animal's senses. So that can be hearing, eyesight, smell, taste, so maybe a different food that they've never had, maybe a little bit of perfume in their enclosure so that they can smell the different scent that they've never smelled, some spices, anything like that that would just really trigger their senses. The last one is food enrichment. That's a really easy one because usually we try not to feed animals in dishes because then they just finish this up in 1 second, just like most of our dogs at home. And then for the rest of the day, they don't have anything to do. So what we try to do is to give them different feeding times. Of course, we have to respect the animal's natural history. So if that's an animal that in the wild would eat one large meal, then that might be something that we try to do for that species. But a lot of animals, especially animals that graze and browse all day long, they usually will eat and look for food all day long. So we need to make sure that they're being kept busy. So what we can do for their food enrichment is scatter it around the enclosure so that they have to go around and forage just like they would do in the wild, and that can take them quite some time to find every little bit of food that's been scattered around the enclosure. So those are the different categories for enrichment that we try to use with our zoo animals, and I'll show you some examples of how we can use them for our pet animals as well at home.
Put her on the World Cup soccer team.
So now that we've talked about the 5 different categories of enrichment, I would like to show you some videos where you can see examples of how we've applied them to zoo animals, and also show you examples of how we're applying them to our pets at home as well. Another big part of the zookeeper job is actually to be able to do training, which is also part of enrichment, as part of the animal's day-to-day care. So one really important part of our day-to-day care for the animals is to work on husbandry behaviors that will make them participate in their own care, especially with veterinarians. So what we need to do often is teach them things like taking voluntarily a full physical exam, as well as being able to get an ultrasound done voluntarily, or injections, blood draws, vaccinations, all those things that happen every year with these animals, and we need to be able to make sure that it's low stress and that they are voluntarily participating in those things. So what we do a lot of the times to be able to train them for those things is, first of all, we have to be protected contact. So what that means is that there's always a barrier or a mesh in between us and the animal. So what that means in training is that you actually cannot physically go and move the animal around. So it involves a little bit more creativity to be able to find how this animal will learn what you're trying to teach it. So what we do often is we use more targeting and more tools that will help us move the animal around. We'll also do some shaping, and we will try and teach these animals at a distance, or at least through that barrier or mesh. We will try and teach them to do those behaviors, and we also are unable to give them food where we would normally with our pets. So we have to be able to use tools to be able to give them the treats. So for example, tongs are usually used so that we can stay safe and the animal receives the food on their side of the mesh. So with our pets though, that's usually something that's not always, it's a little bit taken for granted that animals will go to the vet every year for their vaccinations, and not many people prepare the animals for those kinds of procedures. So I have a few things I'd like to show you with my dog Creature here that we've trained her to do so that whenever she goes to the vet, it's low stress for her, she knows what to expect, and we can go from there. So the first thing is a simple target. So I simply have a lid here, a lid that she has been trained to touch with her nose. So just to show you simply what that looks like. Touch. Yes, good girl. So she does have some duration to this behavior. Yes. And the duration was worked on gradually. So at first we would just reward her for touching it. Yes. Yes. And eventually I started waiting a little longer and waiting for her to hold on to the target a little bit longer before I bridged, when my bridge with her is yes. 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 Good girl. Yes. And now that she knows how to target this lid, I actually can get rid of the lid and simply use my hand. So I've trained her to be able to target my hand and stay still. So she can do a chin target just like this, which is actually very useful to be able to make her stay still in veterinary scenarios where she would need to get an exam done. So her job is to maintain this position, yes, until the person or the vet is done their procedure. Yes, good girl. Yes. So from being able to do chin targeting, we are able to include tactiles so that the dog knows to hold position when there's a big distraction like this hand here. Yes, good girl. So she has to hold position even though my hand is here, and then she will let me then do what the veterinarian would do, which could include checking her ears, checking just checking her body condition. Yes. And her job is to stay still and hold the target. So that's a very important behavior to train so that the animals that are a little bit more nervous with vet procedures can actually receive all this care voluntarily and on their own will. So one more thing that I've actually moved on from with this exercise is being able to brush their teeth. So Creature never liked a toothbrush. That's something that she really did not like very much. So I spent a lot of time desensitizing her to it. So by using this hand target that I've been working on with her, with the chin, but also with the top of her nose, yes, then I've been able to work on introducing the toothbrush and working up my way up to being able to actually brush her teeth. So I'll just show you what that looks like. So at first she targets my hand just like she was doing with the lid, and then I just gently am able to check her teeth. Yes. And she knows to stay pretty still as she's getting checked. Yes. And then from there, see, we are able to target. Yeah, good girl. Yes, just gently at first. Target. Yes. And then more, the better they get, then the better you can start brushing your teeth a little bit harder, a little bit longer. Get into the areas that they might not like at first. Target. Yes, good girl. Yes. There we go, good girl. One more. So now that you've seen an example of how to do a bit of a physical exam on a dog, as well as being able to brush their teeth, I would like to show you another way that we can train a dog to voluntarily show their teeth. So for vet exams, that's usually a very important part, and often dogs don't like showing their teeth. So what we do with zoo animals is we train them to open their mouth on cue. So I will show you a few pictures and videos of what that looks like with opening their mouth on cue. And depending on which kind of animal it is that we're working with, often it has to be trained a different way. So sometimes we will bring some food close to the animal. They will open their mouth to take the food, and that's when we will bridge and reinforce the animal and then shape it and go from there. But with the dog, what we've done with Blevy here is we've trained her to target fingers and being able to open each side of her mouth with our fingers. So I'll show you what that looks like. Yes, good girl. Good. Yes, good. So with being able to do this, I'm now able to open her mouth, check all of her teeth, even the ones at the very back, as well as being able to pull her lips back so that we can make sure that all of her teeth are good. And if we go to a veterinary exam, I can do this, and the veterinarian can just have a look at the mouth and then see the teeth without actually having to touch the animal. Good. 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 Yes. Good girl. Very nice. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching some of the training, the husbandry training that we've been doing with our dogs, Blevy and Creature. But if you keep watching, you'll see some more examples of training that we've done at the zoo with tigers, snow leopards, and they are doing voluntary training. So I have a video of ultrasound with snow leopards, as well as injection training with tigers, as well as a crate training with red pandas. And you can see how even with animals that are not necessarily your usual type of animal to be trained, it's just the same concept, and it's really important to lower their stress, being able to just apply day-to-day things into a fun, enriching activity like training. So that's a really good way to use their food, by being able to train them for their food, make them work, think a little bit. It's enrichment for pets and for wild animals at the zoo. And this is what we do a lot of the times to being able to take better care of them all the time. In the next few videos, try to pay special attention at how targeting was used to be able to get to certain behaviors with animals that we cannot be in the same room with. So there's the first video will be a video with the tiger training. In that video we're working on voluntary injection. So if you take a look at the person sitting on the left side, the person has the needle, but it's not a real needle, so at the end of the needle is blunt instead of being really sharp. And what we're working on doing there is training the animal to position herself against the mesh and push her hip into the mesh. So with that video, we're already past a few beginning steps, and we are at the point where she is pushing her hip into the mesh. She's positioning herself really nice and straight along the mesh. And what we're working on is her letting us touch her with the needle without actually puncturing the skin. And we are also working on her actually pushing into the needle. So all those examples that are coming up are examples of how we can use targeting to get to certain results, just like this. So in that example, have a look. Whenever the needle touches the cat's skin, we're actually waiting for the cat to push back a tiny bit, and that's when the person that has the needle is bridging with the whistle, and the person sitting on the right is feeding the reinforcement to the animal. By having the person on the left with the needle bridging, that's the most important part, because they are the people that can feel what the animal is doing. So that's why that is the person with the whistle. That is really important to bridge when the animal is pushing back, even if it's just a little bit, because we want the animal to have a lot of confidence into pushing into the needle, so that when we're doing a real injection, they are totally comfortable with us pushing the needle in, and then they can even push back into the needle a little bit, and then that's when we stop the injection, reward, and the animal doesn't even realize that it was any different than in training. The following video will be an example of hoof trim with a potbelly pig. So the targeting that's happening in that video is the pig is actually targeting both of their front feet into a little wooden station. So that was trained separately. So the animal is trained to come around the station, step in with their 2 feet, and then we've desensitized picking up the feet and using a file onto their hoof. So you can have a look at that example as well. And then the last example for the zoo animal is the snow leopard ultrasound, which is another interesting example for targeting, because what we're doing there is the veterinarian has to be sitting underneath the animal to be able to touch their belly from under. So you'll see in that video, our veterinarian is sitting on the ground and has his arm stretched out with the ultrasound wand in his hand. and he's actually taking the ultrasound from underneath, and we have a special table designed just for that training. So that table is, there's a little door right underneath it that we can open up, and then the vet can put the wand directly onto the animal's belly. So to train that, what we had to do is desensitize the animal, of course, to being touched in that area. So once that was done, we actually used targeting by using just a wooden stick or anything that had the same shape as the ultrasound wand. And then what we would do is touch her belly, and then whenever she would let us touch her belly, we would bridge and reinforce. But also, whenever we would touch her belly with the wand, we would actually back up a little bit and wait for her to rest her belly back onto it. Because for an ultrasound, there's actually a need for quite a bit of pressure and movement from the wand onto the belly. So we wanted her to be very comfortable with that and not try to lift her belly up as the wand is pushing into it. So we had to make sure that she would push down on her own and really maintain that pressure so that we're able to push against her as she's pushing down. So you'll be able to see that's the final result. That's when we're doing a real ultrasound, but you'll be able to see that the one is pushing into the belly pretty hard, and she's actually maintaining position. And when we were doing the training, the trainer was the one doing the ultrasound or the fake ultrasound, and what we were bridging for was whenever she would relax and push back down with her belly onto the wand that we had. So those are all examples of how we use different targeting, and it's not always just the nose target to train different behaviors with animals that we cannot be in the same space as. The last little clip that I have in here is a video of feet target with cats, domestic cats. So you can see that they're targeting their front feet onto a little target that's round. And then they're also doing a nose target to go from one foot target to the other. So that is all kinds of targeting that we can do with cats. And then there's a couple pictures as well of targeting with a tiger that has now evolved into doing a full belly present from the tiger. So the tiger goes up on their front feet on the mesh, and we're able to have a look at the whole underside. So that was started by simply teaching the animal, just like I do with the domestic cat in that first video, to touch the target with their nose, and then eventually higher and higher, and we kept bridging for the cat to touch the target higher and higher on the mesh. And then eventually what we did is we simply faded the target. So instead of having the animal fully touch their nose on the target through the mesh, we went to having the animal just going up towards the target, and then eventually the target was less and less obvious, and the hand became more obvious, with the cue being up towards the end. So you'll see it on those pictures. So have fun with targeting. There's lots that can be done, from the nose target I showed you first with the toothbrush, and the mouth target with the opening of the mouth on both sides of the fingers, to targeting different parts of the animal's body, from the legs to the hip. And there's lots that can be done with that, as well as training for stress-free voluntary vet procedures, which is really huge, even for our pets that we often find is a little bit taken for granted, that they go to the veterinarian and they just receive those procedures. But often if we can train them to know what to expect and to respond properly, then that can really eliminate a lot of stress from our pets too. I hope you enjoyed the videos, and have fun training the targets.
It was good, yeah. Poke.
Station. Good. 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 Great. Oh, sorry. Still going.